The rain came down on London that morning, in a thin, cold mist that made the cobblestones shine like wet glass. Inside a small room above a bookshop on a quiet street, a young woman named Vivienne Marsh sat at a narrow desk and read the same line of a letter 3 times without seeing it. Her tea had gone cold beside her. The smell of old paper and beeswax filled the room, and somewhere below her a cat was scratching at a door and mewing to be let in. She set the letter down. She rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. Her fingers were stained with ink at the tips, and the little cut on her thumb from mending a pen the night before still stung when she pressed it. The letter was from her cousin Petra, who lived in service at a large house in the country. Petra wrote every fortnight, and her letters were always short and full of small news. But this letter was not short. This letter had been written in a hurry, and the ink was smudged in places, as if Petra had been crying while she wrote. Vivienne read it once more, and this time the words landed. Petra had been arrested. A necklace had gone missing from the mistress of the house, and Petra had been the one to clean the room that morning. The constable had come. Petra had been taken to the county jail. She would stand trial at the next assizes, which was to be held in a fortnight in the market town of Ashford. And Petra swore, on the memory of her mother, that she had not taken the necklace. She swore it 3 times in the letter. She said she did not know what would happen to her. She said she was very frightened. She said she did not want to die. Vivienne set the letter down again and looked at the rain on the window. She was 23 years old. She had been living alone above the bookshop for 2 years, since her father had died and left her almost nothing. She earned her bread by copying letters and documents for a solicitor down the street and by writing letters for people who could not write their own. She was thin and plain and quiet, and most people who passed her on the street did not see her. But she had a straight back and a steady hand, and when she made up her mind about a thing, she did not change it. She made up her mind now. She rose from the desk. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She went to the small trunk at the foot of her bed and counted her savings. There were £7 and a few shillings. It was not much, but it would be enough. She wrote a short note to the solicitor to say she would be away for 2 weeks. She packed a small bag with 2 dresses, a shawl, a comb, and her mother's old prayer book. She put on her cloak. It was thin, and the mist would soak through it before she reached the coaching inn, but it was the only cloak she had. Before she left, she stood a moment at the window and looked out at the wet street below. Her breath made a small cloud on the cold glass. She thought about Petra as a child, running through a summer field with her hair coming loose from its ribbon. She thought about how Petra had always been the brave one, the one who climbed the tallest trees and jumped the widest streams. And now Petra was sitting in a cold cell somewhere, waiting to be tried for a thing she had not done. Vivienne pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. Then she turned and went down the stairs. The coach to Ashford left at 10, and it was full of people and the smell of damp wool. Vivienne sat by the window and watched the city slip away behind her. A fat man across from her ate a pie out of a paper wrapper, and the smell of onions and cold gravy filled the coach. A child in the seat behind her cried for a while, and then fell asleep. The road turned to mud outside the city, and the coach lurched from side to side, and Vivienne held her bag close and thought about what she would say when she reached Ashford. She had never been to a trial before. She did not know how a trial worked. She did not know if she would be allowed to speak, but she knew that Petra had no one else. Petra's mother was dead. Petra had no father that anyone knew of. There was only Vivienne, and the £7 in her purse, and the ache in her chest that had settled there the moment she read the letter and had not moved since. She reached Ashford 2 days later, in the middle of the afternoon, tired and bruised from the coach. The town was small, with a stone church at one end and the assize court at the other, and a wide market square between them. She took a room at a modest inn called the Fox and Hare, where the innkeeper's wife looked her up and down with kind, tired eyes and gave her a small room at the back for 2 shillings a night. The room smelled of soap and lavender, and the sheets were rough but clean. That evening, Vivienne walked to the county jail and asked to see her cousin. The jailer was a heavy man with a red face, and he looked at her for a long moment before he shrugged and said she could have 10 minutes. He led her down a stone passage that smelled of damp and something worse underneath, and he opened a heavy door and let her into a small cell where Petra was sitting on a wooden bench with her hands folded in her lap. Petra looked up. Her face was thinner than Vivienne remembered, and there were dark marks under her eyes. Her dress was dirty at the hem. But when she saw Vivienne, she stood up so quickly that she almost fell, and she crossed the cell in 2 steps and threw her arms around her cousin, and the two of them stood in the middle of the cold stone room and held each other without speaking. "You came," Petra said at last in a voice that shook. "Of course I came," Vivienne said. "You should not have. It is not safe." "It is not." "Hush," Vivienne said, and she pulled back and took Petra's face in her hands. Petra's cheeks were cold. Her eyes were red. "Tell me everything. From the beginning. Every small thing. Leave nothing out." Petra told her. The story came out in pieces, with tears and pauses and small hiccups of breath. She had been in service at Fenwick Hall for 3 years. She had worked as an under-housemaid, cleaning the rooms of the mistress of the house, a woman named Mrs. Cardew, who was the widow of a wealthy merchant and who had come to live at the hall with her son and her son's wife. Mrs. Cardew had a necklace of small pearls and a ruby drop that she wore only on the finest occasions. 2 weeks ago, the necklace had gone missing from her jewel box. Petra had been the last person to clean the room that morning. She had dusted the mantelpiece and swept the hearth and shaken out the curtains, and she had gone back down to the kitchen for her breakfast. That afternoon, Mrs. Cardew had opened her jewel box and found the necklace gone. The house had been searched, and in the bottom of Petra's small wooden box in the servants' quarters, wrapped in one of Petra's own handkerchiefs, the necklace had been found. "I did not put it there," Petra said. "I swear to you on my mother's grave. I did not touch it. I have never touched it. I do not even know what it looks like, except that Nan the cook told me about it once. Then who put it there?" Petra shook her head. "I do not know. I have thought about it every hour of every day since they took me. I do not know. There are 12 of us in the servants' quarters. Any one of them could have done it. But I do not know why anyone would want to hurt me. I have been kind to everyone. I have quarreled with no one. I do not understand." Vivienne was quiet for a long moment. She sat down on the bench beside her cousin and took her hand. Petra's fingers were cold and rough. There was a fresh scrape across the knuckle of her thumb. "Who is the judge?" Vivienne asked. "They say it is to be a duke. His Grace the Duke of Ravensmere. He is the assize judge for this circuit. They say he is very hard. They say he sentenced a boy to hang last spring for stealing a horse. They say he has no mercy in him." Vivienne closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and squeezed Petra's hand. "I will be there," she said. "I do not know if they will let me speak. But I will be there. And I will stand up for you. Whatever happens, you will not be alone in that room." Petra began to cry again then, in small, quiet gasps, and Vivienne held her until the jailer came back and said the 10 minutes were up. That night, Vivienne could not sleep. She lay on her narrow bed at the Fox and Hare and listened to the wind pushing at the shutters, and she thought about how she would find some way to help Petra. She had no money for a proper lawyer. She had no witnesses of her own. But she was clever with words, and she had been copying legal documents for 2 years, and she had a small idea of how such things worked. She thought about it until the church bell rang 3, and then she fell into a thin, uneasy sleep. In the morning, she went to the assize court and asked the clerk when the trial would be. The clerk was a thin, tired man with ink on his fingers, and he looked at her over the tops of his spectacles. "Which trial, miss?" "The trial of Petra Marsh. For theft. Of a necklace from Fenwick Hall." The clerk turned pages in a heavy book. "Ah, that one. The day after tomorrow, 10 in the morning. His Grace the Duke will preside. May I attend? The gallery is open to the public. You may sit there if there is room, but you may not speak unless called as a witness. You are not called as a witness, I take it?" "No, then you may sit, and you may listen. Nothing more." Vivienne nodded and thanked him and went out into the cold morning. She stood on the steps of the court for a long time and looked at the market square. The wind was sharp. It smelled of wood smoke and horse and something roasting on a fire at the corner. She thought about the clerk's words. Sit and listen. Nothing more. But she was not made to sit and listen, not while her cousin's life hung on the words of strangers. She spent the rest of that day, and the next, walking the town and asking small, quiet questions. She had a way about her, plain, honest, unhurried, that made people talk to her. She sat with the innkeeper's wife in the kitchen and drank weak tea and heard about the Cardew family. Mrs. Cardew was known in the town as a proud woman who paid her bills late and treated her servants poorly. Her son, Mr. Alaric Cardew, was a quiet man who did not spend much time at the hall. Her son's wife, Mrs. Sabine Cardew, was a beauty who had been the daughter of a country parson and had married up. Vivienne listened. She did not push. But she remembered every word. She went to the market and bought a small loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese, and she sat on a low stone wall and ate them and watched the people go by. A groom from Fenwick Hall came into town for the mistress's boots to be mended, and Vivienne fell into step beside him and asked him about the hall, and he was lonely enough to talk. He told her that on the morning the necklace went missing, Mrs. Sabine Cardew had come down to the servants' hall in a strange mood, laughing at nothing and speaking sharply to the cook. He told her that Mrs. Sabine had a great many debts of her own from card games in London, and that Mr. Alaric did not know about them. Vivienne thanked him and gave him a penny for his trouble and walked back to the inn with her heart beating quickly. She did not have proof. She had only whispers and a suspicion. But she had something. The morning of the trial was cold and grey. Vivienne dressed in her one good dress, a dark blue wool that had been her mother's, and she pinned her hair up neatly and put on her thin cloak. She walked to the assize court through streets that were slick with new rain, and she took a seat in the gallery at the back of the room, near a pillar where she could see the whole courtroom. The room was larger than she had thought it would be. It smelled of wood polish and old smoke and the wet wool of many coats. There was a high bench at the front where the judge would sit, and below it a long table for the clerks. To one side there was a small enclosed box for the prisoner, and to the other side a bench for the jury. The gallery ran along the back wall, and it was already half full when Vivienne arrived. She sat down and pressed her hands flat against her knees to keep them from shaking. She had never been in such a room before. The wood of the bench was cold through her dress. Somewhere a clock was ticking. At 5 minutes to 10, they brought Petra in. She looked very small in the prisoner's box. Her hair had been pulled back neatly, but her dress was still stained at the hem, and her face was pale. She looked up at the gallery and found Vivienne, and Vivienne raised her hand slightly. Petra tried to smile. It did not quite work, but she tried. At 10 exactly, the bailiff called the room to stand, His Grace the Duke of Ravensmere presiding. A door opened at the side of the room, and a man came in. He was tall. That was the first thing Vivienne noticed. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, and he wore the black robe and the small white wig that judges wore in that country and in that time, and he moved with the steady weight of a man who had never in his life needed to hurry. His face was not what she had expected. She had expected an old man, a man with a hard, thin mouth and cold eyes. This man was not old. He was perhaps 35, no more. His face was serious, but there was something in it that was not cruel. A stillness, a kind of watching. His eyes were dark. When he sat down at the high bench and settled his robes around him, every person in the room sat down at the same time, and every whisper stopped, without his having to say a word. Vivienne felt her breath catch in her throat, and she did not know why. The trial began. The clerk read out the charge. Petra Marsh, housemaid at Fenwick Hall, was accused of stealing a necklace of pearls and rubies, the property of Mrs. Honoria Cardew, on the morning of the 11th of last month. How did she plead? Petra's voice was very small. Not guilty, Your Grace. The Duke wrote something down. He did not look up. The prosecution called Mrs. Cardew as its first witness. She was a heavy woman in a black silk dress, and she carried a small handkerchief that she pressed to her lips at every second sentence. She told her story with a great deal of feeling. The necklace had been a gift from her late husband. It was the dearest thing she owned. On the morning of the 11th she had gone out to walk in the garden, and when she returned at midday, she had opened her jewel box to choose earrings for the afternoon, and the necklace was gone. She had raised the alarm at once. The house had been searched, and in the box belonging to that girl, She pointed a shaking finger at Petra. The necklace had been found, wrapped in the girl's own handkerchief. The prosecution called the housekeeper, a stiff woman named Mrs. Denby, who confirmed the search and the finding of the necklace. She said Petra had been the last servant to clean the room that morning. She said Petra had been alone in the room for perhaps 10 minutes. The prosecution called the constable, who confirmed the arrest. Then the prosecution rested. The Duke looked up from his notes. "Does the prisoner have counsel?" Petra shook her head. "No, Your Grace. I could not afford it." "Then does the prisoner wish to speak on her own behalf?" Petra opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at Vivian, and Vivian could see the fear in her cousin's face, the way it made her tongue stop working. "I did not do it, Your Grace," Petra said at last. "I never touched the necklace. I do not know how it came to be in my box. I swear it on my mother." The Duke wrote something down. "Is that all?" Yes, Your Grace. I do not know what else to say." The Duke set down his pen. His face was still. He looked at Petra for a long moment. Vivienne could not tell what he was thinking. His eyes gave nothing away. "The evidence before this court," he began, in a voice that was low and clear and carried into every corner of the room, "is that the necklace was found in the prisoner's possession. The prisoner had the opportunity to take it. The prisoner denies the charge, but offers no evidence to the contrary. In such circumstances, the law is—" Vivienne stood up. She did not remember deciding to stand up. Her body simply rose from the bench. Her hands were shaking, but her voice, when it came out, was steady. "Your Grace," she said. "Please, may I speak?" The whole room turned. Every face in the gallery turned toward her. The clerks at the long table turned. The jury turned. Mrs. Cardew, in the front row of the witness benches, turned and stared at her with her mouth open. Petra, in the prisoner's box, made a small sound like a caught breath, and the Duke of Ravensmere, at the high bench, slowly lifted his eyes from his notes and looked at Vivienne Marsh for the first time. His gaze was not what she had expected. She had expected anger. She had expected the sharp, cold voice of a great man interrupted. But his eyes only settled on her, quiet and steady, and he did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, very calmly, "Who are you?" "My name is Vivienne Marsh, Your Grace. I am the prisoner's cousin. She has no one else in the world. I have come from London to stand for her. Please, I do not ask to change your ruling. I only ask that you hear me for 1 minute. 1 minute, and then I will sit down, and you may decide as you see fit." The bailiff took a step toward her. The Duke lifted one hand, and the bailiff stopped. "1 minute, Miss Marsh," the Duke said. "Speak." Vivienne's mouth was dry. Her heart was beating in her throat so loudly she could hear it. But she looked straight at the high bench and she began. "Your Grace, the necklace was found in my cousin's box." "That is true. But my cousin did not put it there. I know she did not, because I know her. I have known her since she was a child. She has never taken a thing that did not belong to her. Not a ribbon, not a crust of bread, not a penny. She has been in service at Fenwick Hall for 3 years, and in 3 years there has been no complaint against her, not one. You may ask the housekeeper if I speak the truth." She glanced at Mrs. Denby, who pressed her lips together but did not deny it. "Your Grace, the necklace was found in my cousin's box, wrapped in her own handkerchief. If a girl had truly stolen such a necklace and hidden it in her own room, she would have hidden it well. She would have wrapped it in a rag, in a cloth of no value, in something that could not be traced to her. She would not have wrapped it in a handkerchief with her own name embroidered on the corner. She would not have left it where the first search would find it. Your Grace, my cousin is many things, but she is not a fool." The Duke's eyes did not move from her face. He did not write anything down. "Your Grace, there is one more thing. I do not have proof. I only have what I have heard in this town in the last 2 days. But I have heard that Mrs. Sabine Cardew, the daughter-in-law of the mistress of the hall, has debts. Debts of her own, from card games in London that her husband does not know about. I have heard that on the morning the necklace went missing. She came down to the servants' hall in a strange mood, and she was in the house that morning, and she had reason to want money that no one would trace to her. I do not say she took the necklace. I do not have the right to say it, and I will not. I only ask, Your Grace, that before you send my cousin to be hanged for a thing she did not do, you ask one more question. Ask where the necklace is now. Ask who has seen it since it was taken from my cousin's box. Ask if there is any chance at all, that another hand touched it before it was found. She stopped. Her breath was coming quickly. Her hands were shaking so hard that she pressed them flat against the wooden rail of the gallery to hide it. The room was silent. Not a silence of waiting. A silence of shock. Every face was turned toward her. Mrs. Cardew's mouth was still open. Petra was weeping silently, one hand pressed against her lips. The Duke of Ravensmere sat very still at the high bench. He looked at Vivienne for what felt like a long time, but was only perhaps 10 seconds. His face gave nothing away. His dark eyes rested on hers with a weight that she could feel like a hand on her chest. Then he said, "Sit down, Miss Marsh." She sat down, her knees folded under her, and she nearly missed the bench, but she sat down. The Duke turned his head toward the clerk. "This court will adjourn for 1 hour. I will speak with the housekeeper of Fenwick Hall in my chambers. I will also speak with Mrs. Sabine Cardew. Send for her. The prisoner will remain in the box." He rose. Everyone rose. He left the room through the side door, his black robe moving quietly behind him. The hour that followed was the longest hour of Vivienne Marsh's life. She sat in the gallery and stared at the empty high bench and tried to breathe. Petra, in the prisoner's box, did not look at her. Petra was crying steadily now, small silent tears that ran down her cheeks and dripped onto her folded hands. Mrs. Cardew whispered furiously to the man beside her, and pointed at Vivienne, and pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. The gallery buzzed with low, urgent talk. A woman 2 rows in front of Vivienne turned around and stared at her for a long moment before turning back. Vivienne did not move. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her back straight. And she did not let the tears that pressed at the back of her eyes come forward. An hour later, the bailiff called the room to stand again, and the Duke returned to the bench. His face was the same as before. Still, watching, nothing given away. He sat. Everyone sat. He picked up his pen. He set it down. He looked at Petra in the prisoner's box. "Miss Marsh," he said. It took Vivienne a moment to understand that he was speaking to her cousin, not to her. "Miss Petra Marsh." "Stand, please." Petra stood. Her legs were shaking. She held the rail of the box with both hands. "In the last hour," the Duke said, "I have spoken with the housekeeper of Fenwick Hall. I have spoken with Mrs. Sabine Cardew. Mrs. Sabine Cardew has confessed. She took the necklace on the morning of the 11th. She wrapped it in a handkerchief taken from your box and placed it there when the household was at breakfast. She meant to remove it later that day and pawn it in the town. She was interrupted by the discovery. She allowed you to be arrested rather than confess. She has now confessed. She has been taken into custody. You are free to go. The court apologizes for what you have suffered. This case is dismissed." He set down his pen. The room burst into sound. Petra sank to her knees in the prisoner's box and wept into her hands. Mrs. Cardew made a low, terrible noise and sagged against the man beside her. The clerks began to write furiously. The bailiff stepped forward and opened the door of the prisoner's box, and Petra, still weeping, stumbled out and ran up the aisle toward the gallery, and Vivienne came down the steps to meet her, and the 2 of them stood in the middle of the courtroom and held each other, and Vivienne could not tell whose tears were on her cheeks. Above them, at the high bench, the Duke of Ravensmere watched. He did not speak. He did not smile. He simply watched, with that same steady, weighted gaze, and when Vivienne looked up through her tears and met his eyes, he inclined his head, very slightly, and then he rose and left the room. That was the end of the trial. But it was not the end of the story. Vivienne took Petra back to the Fox and Hare, and the innkeeper's wife brought them hot soup and bread, and made a great fuss over Petra. And Petra ate and cried and ate again, and by the evening she was sleeping in the small back room with her hand curled under her cheek like a child. Vivienne sat by the window and watched her cousins sleep, and only then did the shaking that she had held off all day come and find her, and she sat with her arms around herself for a long time and let it move through her. In the morning there was a knock at the door of the inn. The innkeeper came up the stairs and told Vivienne, in a voice full of wonder, that a gentleman was downstairs asking for her. A gentleman in a fine coat, he said. A gentleman who did not give his name, but who said that Miss Marsh would know him. Vivienne smoothed her dress. She went downstairs. He was standing in the small front parlour of the inn, looking out at the market square through the window. He wore no black robe today, no wig. He was dressed in a dark coat and a plain white shirt, and his hair, she had not seen his hair yet, was dark and cut short, and slightly curled at the ends. He turned when she came in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "Miss Marsh, forgive me for calling on you without invitation. I did not know how else to say what I wished to say. Your Grace." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She curtsied. "You do not need an invitation. I owe you. You owe me nothing." He said it quickly, before she could finish. "That is why I have come." She waited. He seemed to be searching for the words. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at her. "Yesterday in that courtroom," he said, "I was about to sentence your cousin to death. I would have. The evidence was clear enough by the standards of the law. I have sentenced others on less. I would have done it, and I would have gone home last night and slept, and I would not have thought of it again by the end of the week. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked." He paused. His voice was very quiet. "You stopped me." Vivienne said nothing. She did not trust her voice. "I have been a judge for 11 years, Miss Marsh. In 11 years, no one has ever stood up in my court. Not a lawyer, not a family member, not the accused themselves. People are frightened of me. I am aware of this. I have used it. It has made my work easier. And yesterday a young woman I had never seen in my life stood up in my gallery and asked me for 1 minute, and told me that I was about to be wrong." He looked at her. "You were right. I owe you my thanks. I owe your cousin more than my thanks. I have written to Mr. Alaric Cardew this morning. I have told him that he is to pay your cousin 1 year's wages as compensation for what she has suffered, and that if he does not, I will make it my personal business to see that he does. He will pay. He is not a bad man. He is only married to a bad woman, and he will do what I have asked. Your Grace, please, let me finish. I have one more thing to say, and then I will go." She nodded. He took a slow breath. He looked at his hands again. Then he looked up. "I came to Ashford 3 days ago, before the trial, in disguise. I do this sometimes. I am aware that people prepare for me. I am aware that servants are told to say one thing and hide another. I am aware that when a judge arrives in a town in his black coach with his crest on the door, the town rearranges itself before he steps down. So I come early. I come as a common traveller. I take a room somewhere small. I walk the streets. I listen. I do this because I have been lied to before, Miss Marsh, and I have made rulings on those lies, and I have lived with what came of those rulings. I do not care to add to the list." He paused. "I was staying at the White Lamb, at the other end of the square, on the second day of my visit, which was the day before the trial. I was sitting in the tap room eating a bad supper, and a young woman came in with a groom from Fenwick Hall. She sat with him at the corner table. She spoke to him kindly. She did not push him. She asked him small questions and let him talk. I was not 5 feet from her. I heard every word. Vivienne's hand went to her mouth. "You," she said. "I did not wear my wig, Miss Marsh. I did not wear my robe. I had 2 days of beard on my face and a coat that had been in the rain. You did not see me. But I saw you. I saw a young woman who had travelled from London on a coach without a proper cloak, who was spending her own money at an inn, who was talking gently to a lonely groom for the sake of her cousin, and who was asking exactly the right questions. I sat there and I finished my supper, and I paid my bill, and I walked back to the White Lamb, and I thought about you all the way. I do not think I have ever in my life thought so hard about a person I had not been introduced to." Vivienne could not speak. Her hand was still against her mouth. Her eyes were burning. "When you stood up in my court yesterday, Miss Marsh, I was not surprised. I was only surprised that it had taken you so long. When you spoke about Mrs. Sabine Cardew, I already knew what you were going to say, because I had heard the groom say it to you. I could have sat there and pretended not to know. But you had come to that courtroom without a witness, without a lawyer, without a single person in the world to help you, and you had stood up anyway. I do not think I have ever seen anything braver, and I did not have it in me to let you stand alone." He stopped. He looked at her. "That is what I came to say. I did not come to ask anything of you. I came only to tell you that you were seen, not in the courtroom. Before that, in the tap room, when you thought no one was watching. You were seen, Miss Marsh, and what was seen was enough." For a long time she could not speak. The room around them was very quiet. Somewhere outside a cart was rattling over the cobbles. She could hear her own breath, and his. At last she said, "Your Grace, I did not know. I know you did not. You could have told me. In the courtroom. You could have." "I could not," he said. "The law does not permit a judge to speak of what he has learned outside of court. I could act on it in a way. I could adjourn. I could send for Mrs. Sabine and question her on the evidence you had presented. I could not stand up on that bench and say I had followed you to a tap room 2 nights before and eavesdropped on your conversation. I would have been removed from the bench within a week. I did what I could, Miss Marsh. It was not much. It was you who did the thing." She looked at him for a long time. "You said you had been lied to before," she said. "That is why you come in disguise. What lie was it?" He was quiet. She thought he would not answer. Then he did. "My father was a judge before me. He was a good man. 10 years ago, he sentenced a woman to be hanged for the murder of her husband. She had confessed. There were witnesses who said she had threatened the man for months. Her family did not stand up for her. She was hanged. 3 years later, on his deathbed, her brother confessed that he had done the murder, and that he had frightened his sister into taking the blame because she was old and unmarried and had nothing to live for, and he was a young man with a young wife and children. My father lived 4 years after that. He never sat as a judge again. He drank himself to death in a small room in the country. When he died, I took his post, and I made a rule for myself, Miss Marsh. I would never again sit in judgment of a person without seeing that person with my own eyes, in a place where they did not know they were being seen. I have kept that rule for 11 years. Yesterday, that rule saved a life. Not because of me, because of you." Vivienne sat down slowly on the chair by the parlour door. She had not meant to. Her legs simply would not hold her any more. He waited. "Your Grace," she said at last, "I do not know what to say. You do not need to say anything, Miss Marsh. I have said what I came to say. I will trouble you no further." He picked up his hat from the small table by the window. He inclined his head. "May I ask one thing before I go?" he said. "Yes, your cousin. Where will she go?" "Back to London with me. She cannot go back to Fenwick Hall. Not now. Would she consider a place in another household? A good household. Wages more than fair. A housekeeper who is kind. You have such a place?" "I have a house in the county of Berkshire," he said. "It is a large house. It has been half closed since my mother died 2 years ago. I have been meaning to open it again. It needs a full staff. If your cousin would like a position there, it is hers, and there would be a position for you as well, Miss Marsh, if you wished it. Not as a servant. I have a library that has not been catalogued in 30 years. I have been meaning to hire someone with a steady hand and a straight back and a mind of her own. You would be paid properly. You would have your own rooms. You would be a member of the household, not a member of the staff." She stared at him. "Your Grace, I cannot. You can. I am not asking anything of you, Miss Marsh, except that you consider it. Think on it. You do not need to answer today. Write to me at Ravensmere Court, Berkshire. Take a month. Take 2. If the answer is no, I will not trouble you again. If the answer is yes, a carriage will come for you both whenever you send word." He set his hat on his head. He turned to the door. At the door he stopped, and without turning around he said, "I would like to see you again, Miss Marsh. That is the honest thing. I would like it very much. But I do not want you to come to Ravensmere for that reason. I want you to come because it is a good position and you will do it well. If, after some time in that house, you also wish to see me, that will be for you to decide, in your own time, without any weight from me. I will not press. I will not court. I will be a man who lives in the same house as a woman who is cataloguing his library, and nothing more, until she tells me otherwise. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Grace. Good. He opened the door and went out. Vivienne sat in the small parlour for a long time after he was gone. The fire in the grate was low. The room smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and the leather of his coat, which lingered in the air. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she thought about all of it. The coach from London, the cell, the courtroom, the taproom, the man who had sat 5 feet from her and listened to every word and then let her stand up in his court and be the one to save her cousin's life. She thought about it for 3 weeks. She and Petra went back to London. Petra was quiet on the coach. She held Vivienne's hand for most of the journey and did not let go. When they reached London, Petra slept for 2 days in Vivienne's small room above the bookshop, and on the 3rd day she woke up and ate a proper breakfast, and by the end of the week she was laughing again. Not often, but sometimes, and that was enough. Vivienne went back to her copying work. The solicitor was glad to have her back. She sat at her narrow desk in the small room above the bookshop and she copied letters and documents, and every evening she thought about the offer, and every night she went to bed without deciding. She was not afraid of him. That surprised her. A great man had asked her to come and live in his house, and she was not afraid. She was only careful. She had spent her whole life being careful. She was not going to stop now. But every day the small room felt smaller, and every day the ink stains on her fingers seemed darker, and every day the letter from him, a short letter, 3 lines, that had arrived on the 5th day after her return, sat on her desk, and she read it once each morning before she began her work. The letter said only, "I hope this finds you and your cousin well. The offer stands. There is no hurry." Ravensmere. At the end of the 3rd week, Vivienne wrote a letter of her own. She wrote it in the morning, on a clear cold day when the light was coming through her window in a way that made even the old floorboards look kind. She wrote 3 lines. "Your Grace, my cousin and I accept your offer. We would come at the end of the month, if that is agreeable. Marsh." She sent it. 2 days later a carriage came for them. It was not a grand carriage. It was a plain, sturdy carriage with 2 good horses and a driver who touched his hat and did not stare at them. The driver said his master had said to take them slowly and to stop at good inns along the way. He said his master had paid for everything. He said his master had said nothing else. The journey to Berkshire took 3 days. It rained on the 1st day, and the 2nd, and cleared on the 3rd, and when the carriage came around the last bend of the road and Ravensmere Court came into view at the top of a low hill, Vivienne pressed her hand against the window and did not breathe for a moment. It was not the largest house she had ever seen. It was not the grandest. But it was beautiful, in the way that things that have been loved for a long time are beautiful. It was pale grey stone, with tall windows and a wide front step, and there was a garden at the side that was overgrown but still bearing late roses, and a stand of old oaks behind that were shedding their leaves in the wind. Petra squeezed her hand. Petra had said very little on the journey. But now she said, quietly, "Vivienne, it is a good place." "I hope so," Vivienne said. The Duke was not there when they arrived. He had sent word that he was in London on business and would return at the end of the week. The housekeeper, a small stout woman named Mrs. Havers, met them at the door with a broad kind smile and cups of hot tea, and she showed them to their rooms. Petra was to be under housekeeper, with her own small room next to Mrs. Havers's own. Vivienne was given a large sunny room at the corner of the 2nd floor, with a bed with clean linen and a small writing desk by the window, and a fireplace that was already lit. "His Grace said you were to have this room, Mrs. Havers said. He said it had the best light for reading." Vivienne thanked her. When Mrs. Havers had gone, Vivienne sat down on the edge of the bed and looked around the room, and she was very quiet for a while. He returned at the end of the week. She heard the horses on the drive in the late afternoon, and she heard the front door open, and she heard his voice in the hall, the same low, steady voice, greeting Mrs. Havers and asking after the household. She did not go down. She had already decided she would not. She had decided that she would let him come to her, in his own time and not the other way round. He came the next morning. He came to the library, where she was already at work on the great task of the shelves, with a cloth around her hair and her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a pencil behind her ear. He knocked at the open door. She turned. "Miss Marsh, Your Grace." He stood in the doorway. He did not come in. "I hope the room is agreeable." "Very. Thank you. And your cousin?" "She is well." "She likes Mrs. Havers." "Everyone likes Mrs. Havers. It is one of her chief professional qualifications." Vivienne smiled, a little, before she could stop herself. He saw it. Something in his face eased. "I will not disturb your work," he said. "I only wish to say that I am glad you came. That is all." He turned to go. "Your Grace," she said. He turned back. She set down the book she was holding. She wiped her hands on the cloth at her waist. She looked at him. "You said in the parlor at the inn that you did not want me to come for the wrong reasons." "I did not come for the wrong reasons. I came because the position is a good one, and I will do it well. But I want you to know something, before we begin. I do not know how these things go. I have never been in a house like this. I have never spoken to a man like you before I stood up in your courtroom. I do not know what I am doing. But I am not afraid. I want to say that. I am not afraid of you. I do not know if I am supposed to be, and I do not care. I am not." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "That is the best news I have had in a very long time, Miss Marsh." He inclined his head. He left the doorway. She stood in the middle of the library, among the dusty shelves and the piles of unsorted books and the pale autumn light coming through the tall windows. And she pressed her hand against her chest, over her heart, which was beating in a way she had not felt it beat before. The library took her through the winter. There were more than 4,000 books in that room, and they had not been touched in 30 years, and half of them were out of order and a quarter were falling apart. And Vivienne worked at them every day from breakfast until the light failed. Mrs. Havers brought her tea. Petra came in sometimes, in her under-housekeeper's dress, and dusted the tops of shelves that were too high for Vivienne to reach. The Duke came in nearly every evening. He did not court her. He had said he would not, and he did not. He came in and sat in the leather chair by the window and read his own book, and sometimes he asked her about what she had found, and sometimes they spoke for a long time about a particular volume or a particular writer, and sometimes they did not speak at all. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel ticked. The snow began to fall outside the windows, and then to lie thick on the lawn, and then to melt again as the winter turned toward spring. He was kind to Petra. He was kind to Mrs. Havers. He was kind, Vivienne noticed, to everyone in the household, in a quiet, undemonstrative way that was so consistent that after a while she stopped noticing it, the way one stops noticing that the sun rises every morning. There was one afternoon in the middle of February when Vivienne came into the library and found a small package on her desk. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. There was no note. She opened it. Inside was a pair of good leather gloves, lined with soft wool, exactly the right size for her hands. She did not know who had left them. She asked Mrs. Havers. Mrs. Havers said she did not know. She asked Petra. Petra said she did not know either. She did not ask the Duke, because it did not seem like something to ask. She wore the gloves. Her hands stopped being cold when she walked in the gardens in the mornings. It was 3 months later that she learned. She was walking through the village with Mrs. Havers on an errand, and they stopped at the bootmaker's shop to have a pair of Petra's shoes mended, and the bootmaker's wife, a friendly, talkative woman, said, "Ah, Mrs. Havers, and how are the gloves?" His Grace was so particular about the size. He came in 3 times. 3 times, mind you, and asked me to try this pair and that pair against his own hand and imagine his hand were smaller. I never saw a gentleman fuss so over a pair of gloves. Mrs. Havers glanced at Vivienne. Vivienne did not say anything. She smiled at the bootmaker's wife and thanked her, and they left the shop, and Mrs. Havers did not mention it, and neither did Vivienne. But that night, after supper, when the Duke came into the library and sat in his leather chair by the window, Vivienne looked at him over the top of the book she was reading, and she looked at him for a long time, and he felt it and looked up. "Yes?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Only thank you." He looked at her a moment longer. He did not ask what for. He simply inclined his head, and he went back to his book, and after a few moments a very small smile touched the corner of his mouth, and then it was gone. She thought about the gloves for a long time after that. She thought about a man who had gone to a bootmaker's shop 3 times and asked for a pair of gloves to fit a hand he could only imagine, and had them wrapped in brown paper and left on her desk with no note, so that she would not have to thank him. She thought about how easy it would have been for him to hand them to her himself and see her face when she opened them, and how he had chosen not to. The spring came. The gardens at Ravensmere began to grow. Petra had taken over the small kitchen garden as a project of her own, and she came in every evening with her hands dirty and her cheeks pink, and stories about carrots and beans. Vivienne finished the first 3,000 books of the library. She wrote a letter to the solicitor in London and told him she would not be coming back. She sent the last of her rent money to the landlord above the bookshop and asked him to give her small things away to whoever needed them. She was making a life in the pale grey house on the hill. And still the Duke did not press. And still Vivienne did not speak. It was late in April when the last thing happened that needed to happen. A carriage came up the drive one afternoon, and out of it stepped a man Vivienne did not know, and a woman she did not know, and the woman was expensively dressed, and her face was hard, and her eyes were sharp. Mrs. Havers came into the library where Vivienne was working, and told her, in a low, worried voice, that the visitors were Lord and Lady Sotherton, distant cousins of the Duke, and they had come without invitation, and they were in the drawing-room, and Lady Sotherton had been asking after the young woman His Grace had installed in the house. Vivienne set down her pencil. She was not surprised. She had been half expecting something like this since she arrived. Society, she knew, did not like a young unmarried woman living in a duke's house, even as a librarian, even in her own separate rooms. Society would talk, and sooner or later a member of society would come to see for herself. She smoothed her dress. She washed her hands. She took the cloth off her hair. She went down to the drawing-room. The Duke was already there. He was standing by the fireplace, and his face was very still, and his eyes, when he saw her, went to her at once and stayed on her, steady and watchful, the way they had been in the courtroom on the day of the trial. Lady Sotherton was seated on the silk sofa by the window. She was a woman perhaps 40 years old, with a beautiful cold face and a mouth that had been trained to smile without warmth. She looked Vivienne up and down as Vivienne came in. She did not rise. "Ah," she said. "So this is the little librarian." "Miss Marsh," the Duke said quietly. "May I present Lady Sotherton and Lord Sotherton? My cousins. They have come from town." Vivienne curtsied. "My lord, my lady." "Sit down, my dear, sit down," said Lady Sotherton, waving a gloved hand. "We shall not eat you. My husband and I have been meaning to visit dear Ravensmere for months. Such a lovely house. Such a shame it has been so quiet these last years. We came to see how our cousin does. And we hear such interesting things. Such very interesting things." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that came with a knife somewhere behind it. Vivienne sat down carefully on the edge of a chair. Her hands were folded in her lap. The Duke did not sit. He stood by the fireplace, and his eyes did not leave Lady Sotherton's face. "What things have you heard, cousin?" he said. His voice was very even. Lady Sotherton laughed. It was a small silver laugh. "Oh, only the ordinary things, my dear. Only that our dear Ravensmere, who has never in his life kept a woman in his house, has installed a bookseller's clerk from London in the best guest room of the 2nd floor, and has been seen taking tea with her in the library every evening. Only that. It is nothing. But you know how people are. And I have come, dear cousin, out of family feeling, to say that if you would only marry, properly, some suitable woman of good family, all such talk would end. There is no shame in a librarian, of course, but there is also no protection, if you understand me." She turned her cold, beautiful face toward Vivienne. "My dear," she said, in a voice that was sweet and slow and clear, so that every word could be heard from every corner of the room, "you seem a very clever girl, and I am sure your cousin was very grateful to be saved from the noose, or whatever it was. But you must know, in your heart, that you are not the sort of woman a man like our cousin marries. You cannot possibly think that. You are here for a season. He is fond of you in his way. But when he tires of the arrangement, and he will tire, my dear, they always do, you will be sent back to your bookshop with a small pension and a great deal to regret. And by then no honest man in London will marry you either. Do think, dear. Do think while there is still time to think. The room went very still. Vivienne felt the words land in her chest, one by one, precise and cold. Her face did not change. She had trained herself long ago not to let her face change. She looked at Lady Southerton for a long moment, and then she looked down at her hands, and then she looked up again, and she was about to answer. She had already begun to draw the breath, when the Duke of Ravensmere spoke. "Get out of my house." The words were quiet. He did not raise his voice, but they carried into every corner of the drawing-room with the same weight that his voice had carried in the courtroom, and Lady Southerton, halfway through another silver laugh, stopped in the middle of the sound. "I beg your pardon," she said. "You heard me. Get out of my house." Lord Southerton stood up. "Now, look here, cousin. I will speak to you, cousin, before you go. But your wife will not spend another minute under this roof. She has just said, in front of a young woman who is a guest in my house, and a member of my household, and a person to whom I owe more than I owe to anyone else living, that she is not fit to be spoken to as an equal. She is wrong, and she will not correct that error in this room, because I do not want her to correct it. I want her to leave." "Cousin," said Lady Southerton. The Duke turned his eyes on her. He did not say anything. He only looked at her. Lady Southerton stood up. Her face had gone very white. She looked at her husband. Her husband looked at the floor. "Come," she said. "Come, my dear. We are going." They went. The Duke did not move from the fireplace until the front door closed behind them and the carriage wheels sounded on the drive. Then he crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt on one knee in front of Vivienne's chair. She had not expected that. She drew in a small startled breath. He took her hand. His hand was warm. "Miss Marsh," he said. His voice was low, and very close, and not quite steady. "I have kept my word. I said I would not press. I have not pressed. I have wanted to for 8 months. I have wanted to every night when I sat in that leather chair by the window and watched the firelight on your hair. But I said I would not, and I did not. I am breaking my word now, because a woman just said a thing in my house that made me understand I could not keep it any longer. If I do not tell you now what I have wanted to tell you every day since November, then when the next Lady Southerton comes, and there will be another one, you will not know what to believe. And I will not have that. I will not have you sitting in that chair one more time not knowing." He drew a breath. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since I sat in the taproom of the White Lamb and watched you speak to a lonely groom about a necklace. I loved you when you stood up in my court. I have loved you every day since you came to this house, and every day I did not say it. And every day I told myself that a woman who had been treated as you had been treated deserved to be given time, and space, and a house of her own to move through without a man pressing on her. So I gave you time. I gave you space. I gave you the library. I gave you the gloves. And now I am telling you, on my knee in my own drawing room, that I would like very much to marry you, if you will have me. And if you will not, I will still keep every promise I have made. I will not press. You may stay in this house as long as you wish, on the same terms with the same salary, and I will never speak of this again." He stopped. He looked up at her. His dark eyes were very still. Vivienne could not speak for a moment. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled in the grate. Somewhere outside a bird was singing in the spring garden. She looked at the man kneeling in front of her. She thought about the courtroom. She thought about the taproom she had not known he had been in. She thought about the letter with 3 lines. She thought about the small package of gloves on her desk. She thought about a man who had gone to the bootmaker 3 times. She thought about all of it, and it was very simple in the end. She reached out with her free hand and touched his face. His cheek was warm under her palm. She could feel the faint roughness of where he had shaved that morning. His eyes closed for a moment when she touched him. "Yes," she said. That was all she said. That was all she needed, to say. He opened his eyes. He drew her hand to his mouth and kissed the knuckles, very gently, one after another. Then he stood, and he drew her up with him, and he held her against his chest for a long moment without speaking, and Vivienne pressed her face against the soft dark wool of his coat, and breathed in the smell of him, clean linen and something like cedar, and something underneath she still could not name. And she felt his hand at the back of her head, steady, careful, and for the first time in her life she understood, quite completely, what it felt like to be held. They were married in the parish church in the village a month later. It was a small wedding. Petra stood as her attendant, in a new blue dress. Mrs. Hovers cried through the whole service. The Duke did not smile very much during the wedding. He was never a man who smiled much, but when he lifted her hand to his mouth at the altar and looked at her, Vivienne saw in his eyes something that no wedding smile could have carried, and it was enough. Afterward there was a small breakfast at the house. Then the guests went home. Then it was only them, in the pale grey house on the hill, with the spring garden in bloom and the light coming through the tall library windows and the smell of new grass in the air. That evening, Vivienne went into the library. He was already there in his leather chair by the window, with a book on his knee. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the room and sat down in the chair opposite his, and she picked up her own book, and neither of them spoke for a while. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, the last of the light was fading from the sky. At last, she said, without looking up, "You know, I never asked you what your Christian name is." He turned a page in his book. "Corin. Corin. It is a name from an old play. My mother was fond of the play. I like it. I am glad." They read on. After a while, Vivienne set her book down on her knee, and she looked at her husband. And she saw a man who had once sat on a high bench in a black robe, and had been about to send her cousin to be hanged, and who had then stopped, and listened, and gone back to his chambers, and questioned a woman, and dismissed the case, and then come to a small inn the next morning, to say that he had been the one in the taproom, and to say that he had seen her, and that what he had seen was enough. She saw the man who had left her a pair of gloves on her desk with no note. She saw the man who had knelt in the drawing-room and said her name. She did not tell him she loved him. She did not need to. She was quite sure he knew. He looked up, as if he had felt her looking at him. He held out his hand across the small distance between the chairs, without saying a word. She reached across and put her hand in his. He closed his fingers around hers. They sat like that, in the firelight for a long time, and outside the window the stars came out slowly, one by one, over the gardens of Ravensmere. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this moved you, please like, share and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.